Hey everyone. Tonight, we're slipping quietly into a story that begins with a creaking wooden ship, a black, restless ocean, and one man so certain of his destiny that he could almost hear history applauding before it even happened. We're going to follow Christopher Columbus, not as a clean hero, not as a simple villain, but as something far more unsettling. A reputation carefully built, borrowed, and reshaped over centuries, until the name itself became a weapon. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you enjoy drifting off to calm, and drop a comment. When you hear Columbus, what do you picture? Explorer, destroyer, or myth? The night before the ocean swallowed him, Christopher Columbus lay awake listening to the creak of timber and the hiss of black water against a hull no wider than a modern city bus. And he did what desperate men do when the dark grows teeth. He rewrote himself into a hero before anyone else could write him into a fool. He promised a miracle to kings, to God, and to his own fear. And in that promise, more than in any compass bearing, began a legend that would outlive his bones, outlive his sins, outlive even the world he thought he'd found. Because Columbus is not only a man in the past, he is a battlefield in the present. A name that has been polished into a saint, dragged through mud into a villain, and molded into a myth so useful that empires, churches, schools, and cities have carried it like a flag. And if you want to understand why people still argue over him 5 centuries later, why statues rise and fall, why holidays are celebrated or canceled, why one generation calls him discoverer, while another calls him destroyer, you have to follow the story the way the sea followed his ships. Not in a straight line, but in relentless waves, each one reshaping the shoreline of memory. He was born into a world where maps ended in monsters, where Europe's hunger for gold and spice burned hotter than its candles, where Portugal edged down Africa like a thief along a wall, and Spain, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, looked for a shortcut to wealth and prestige that could make it more than a patchwork kingdom stitched together by conquest. Columbus arrived in this moment like a gambler, with a crooked deck and a shining grin, pitching an impossible route west to reach the riches of Asia. And the pitch worked not because it was correct, but because it was intoxicating. A single voyage that could skip rival ports, bypass rival powers, and deliver the East in one dramatic leap. He was wrong about the size of the Earth's ocean, wrong about the distance to Asia, wrong in ways that should have killed him. But wrongness is not always a barrier to history. It can be a fuse. In August 1492, he sailed with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And for weeks the world was nothing but water and dread, and the slow collapse of confidence. Men counted days, like prisoners count bricks. And in that floating pressure cooker, the captain learned what leaders learn when their authority cracks. You must feed the crew a story, or they will feed on mutiny. Later, in retellings, you may hear of a noble commander calming frightened sailors, of discipline and faith triumphing over panic. But even the record that survives hints at bargaining, at threat and persuasion, at a crew close enough to breaking that the legend had to be hammered into place afterward like a patch over a leak. Then the cry, land, and the sudden rise of green against the emptiness, and Columbus stepping onto an island in the Bahamas he would name San Salvador. claiming it for Spain with the formal confidence of a man who believes naming is ownership. He met the Taíno, and in the earliest descriptions he wrote words that later readers would underline in school books as proof of peaceful encounter: generous, unarmed, curious, friendly, and he wrote other words too, words that would become a darker footnote. They would make good servants. With 50 men one could subjugate them all. There were hints of gold, there were hints of others to capture, and right there, on that first shore, the Columbus we argue over begins to split into multiple Columbuses depending on which lines you choose to read aloud. Because the first thing to understand about his reputation is that it was manufactured, from the start by Columbus himself, through letters crafted like advertisements. He needed patrons, titles, wealth, and authority, and in a royal court addicted to spectacle, he sold the voyage as divine theater, proof that God favored Spain's rising power. His initial reports back to Europe dazzled audiences that had never seen pineapples, hammocks, or parrots. He described Edenic landscapes and Indians, who seemed to him innocent and pliable. And while he could not deliver what he had promised, Asian cities, Silk Road wealth, direct access to the Great Khan, he delivered something else more valuable to a conquering monarchy: a claim, a foothold, a new arena for empire. And that claim needed a story clean enough to survive the politics of Spain, the jealousies of rivals, and the scrutiny of a crown that did not hand out perpetual privileges lightly. Columbus demanded extraordinary rewards: noble titles, a share of profits, hereditary power over lands he had yet to map. And in doing so, he planted the seeds of a backlash. Many powerful people in Spain wanted the opportunity he had opened, but not the man himself standing as gatekeeper. And so reputation became currency and weapon. The second thing to understand is that Columbus did not remain on that first shore. He returned again and again, and each return hardened the enterprise from exploration into colonization, from curiosity into extraction. On the second voyage, the fleet was larger, the intention clearer, the machinery of settlement rolling in like a tide that does not retreat. And here, in the raw reality of colony building, the romantic discoverer's story begins to corrode, because colonies demand labor, and labor, when voluntary work does not match imperial appetite, becomes coerced. The Spanish demanded gold and tribute. They established systems that bound indigenous communities into obligation. Diseases arrived as invisible conquistadors, cutting down people who had no immunological memory of Europe's plagues. Violence flared through misunderstandings, resistance, and ruthless retaliation. Columbus himself, appointed governor, became a figure of authority in a brutal, failing project. Settlers complained of hunger, mismanagement, harsh punishments. Indigenous people suffered through enslavement and terror, and the promised riches did not flow like honey. In this pressure, Columbus's behavior, his governance, his discipline, his decisions, became contested even in his own lifetime. He could be visionary and stubborn, charismatic and cruel, devout and calculating. He could write fervent lines about God's will, and in the next breath treat human beings as cargo. The crown began to doubt him. Rivals circled. The paradise story was cracking. Then came humiliation. Complaints reached Spain, and royal officials intervened. Columbus was arrested and sent back in chains. The admiral of the ocean sea, reduced to a prisoner on the deck of the very route that had made him famous. He arrived in Spain not as triumphant discoverer, but as a man pleading for vindication. And in that moment, you can almost see the legend machinery switching gears, because an icon cannot be allowed to look small for long. Columbus fought for his privileges for the rest of his life, arguing, petitioning, insisting that he had been wronged. He died in 1506 still believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia, still convinced of his own indispensability, still chasing recognition like a starving man chasing bread. Yet, almost immediately after his death, his life began to be remade by other hands into a symbol that served needs far beyond his own ambitions. The first major manufacturer of Columbus's reputation was Spain itself, and not only in celebration, but in triage. Spain had built a legal and religious rationale for its new empire, and Columbus, as the initiating figure, was useful as a foundational myth, an origin story that could be framed as providential rather than predatory. But Spain's relationship to him was complicated. He was a foreigner in their court, a troublesome claimant, a man whose contract threatened royal control. Praising him too much could strengthen his heir's demands, and criticizing him too much could tarnish the legitimacy of Spain's claims. So Spanish memory became selective. He was honored as initiator, but contained as employee. His achievements were acknowledged, but his authority was limited. The crown elevated the enterprise while managing the man. Meanwhile, as Spain's empire expanded, Columbus became one name among many: Cortés, Pizarro, and a parade of conquistadors and administrators, each with their own narratives of glory and horror. In the 16th century, the moral debate over the conquest erupted within Spain itself, with figures like Bartolomé de las Casas describing atrocities and arguing that indigenous peoples were human beings with souls and rights. Las Casas's writings, full of indictment, became part of what later Europeans would call the Black Legend, a story of Spanish cruelty that rival powers, England, the Netherlands, France, would amplify to paint Catholic Spain as uniquely barbaric. Here, Columbus's image begins to shift again, not always at the center, but as a convenient opening act. If the conquest was a theater of cruelty, then the man who opened the curtain could be portrayed as complicit, naive, or monstrous, depending on the storyteller's goals. Rival empires wanted to delegitimize Spanish claims, and so they could either diminish Columbus's achievement, suggest he blundered into land others knew, or magnify Spain's sins, suggest Columbus's arrival was the first step in a deliberate catastrophe. But they also wanted the prize Spain had found, and so they could not entirely deny the significance of the voyage without denying the world historical door it opened for themselves. Instead, they reframed it: discovery as accident, conquest as greed, Catholic mission as hypocrisy. A man becomes a mirror when different faces need to see different truths. And then something remarkable happened. Columbus left Europe and moved into the imagination of the future United States, a place that did not exist when he sailed, and yet would later adopt him as a kind of spiritual ancestor. Why? Because young nations need myths more than they need messy biographies. When the United States emerged from revolution, it sought symbols that were older than the Republic and not tied directly to Britain. Columbus, a figure who preceded English colonization, could be claimed as a Pan-American origin without honoring the British crown. Columbia became a poetic name for America. Cities, rivers, institutions adopted the name. Columbus was recast as the visionary who dared the ocean and proved the world was round, an enduring falsehood that reveals more about what the myth required than what the man actually did. In this American retelling, Columbus became a secular saint of bravery and progress, a symbol of destiny and expansion, conveniently disconnected from the lived experience of indigenous peoples who had been here all along. School books softened edges. Illustrations showed solemn landings, fluttering flags, noble gestures. The violence of colonization was blurred into background haze, if mentioned at all. This was not accidental. It was pedagogy as nation building, and Columbus was a perfect candidate because he could be portrayed as adventurous, proto-American, and safely distant from the political fractures of the early republic. Yet even this American Columbus had layers, and the manufacturing continued in the 19th century, when the country's appetite for grand narratives exploded alongside industrial power and territorial expansion. In 1892, the 400th anniversary of the voyage became a national spectacle, culminating in the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a colossal celebration of discovery, modernity, and American progress. It was a World's Fair that displayed technology and empire under the glow of electric lights, suggesting that Columbus's journey led naturally to the triumph of the modern West. The fair's very name linked the man to a national self-image, the United States as heir to exploration, innovation, and a civilizing mission. And in the same era, Columbus's image became bound up with immigrant identity, especially Italian-American identity, because in a nation where immigrants faced discrimination, claiming Columbus as one of ours offered symbolic belonging. If you were told you did not fully count as American, you could point to the man whose name was stamped on cities and rivers and say, "We have been part of this story from the beginning." Organizations like the Knights of Columbus helped cement this connection, promoting Columbus as a Catholic hero in a Protestant-leaning culture, turning him into a bridge between faith, patriotism, and ethnic pride. Eventually, Columbus Day entered the national calendar, and in 1937 it became a federal holiday in the United States. Another layer of official myth-making, a government stamp on a particular version of the past. Notice what's happening. Columbus's reputation here has very little to do with his actual governance in Hispaniola or his arguments with the Spanish crown. It has to do with what 19th and 20th century America needed: a heroic founder, a symbol to unify a diverse population, a story that framed the continent's transformation as inevitable progress rather than contested conquest. Meanwhile, another Columbus was being manufactured in the shadows, the Columbus of indigenous memory, the Columbus of grief. For many indigenous communities, the date of Columbus's arrival is not an inspiring beginning, but a catastrophic turning point. The start of invasion, dispossession, forced labor, cultural destruction, and demographic collapse driven by disease and violence. This perspective was not new, but for centuries it was marginalized in the dominant institutions that wrote textbooks and erected statues. As indigenous activism grew in the 20th century, and scholarship increasingly centered colonized voices, the heroic Columbus narrative began to fracture in public. Historians revisited primary sources and colonial records. They examined systems like encomienda and the early slave raids. They studied the brutal economics of empire. Columbus's own writings, his letters and logs, were read not as inspirational adventure, but as evidence of a worldview that categorized human beings by usefulness and extractable value. Accounts by contemporaries and later chroniclers were weighed. The accusations against Columbus as governor, the testimonies of cruelty, the counterclaims of political rivalry, the context of an age in which conquest was normalized and sanctified. A complicated picture emerged. Columbus as neither solitary villain nor pure hero, but as a man embedded in, and helping to accelerate, a violent imperial system. This complexity is unsatisfying to myth. Myth prefers sharp edges. So, the public. Debate often collapses into extremes. Columbus, the noble explorer, versus Columbus, the genocidal monster. The truth, as usual, is more difficult and more damning in its banality. The age of discovery was also an age of commodifying people, of converting lands into ledgers, of making salvation and slavery share the same ship. Columbus was a product of his time, and he was also an agent who made choices. He did not invent European expansion, but he opened a route that supercharged it. He did not single-handedly destroy entire peoples, but he helped set in motion processes that did. And because different groups have different stakes in that legacy, Columbus becomes a proxy for larger arguments about national identity, morality, and historical responsibility. This is why statues matter so much. They are not neutral history lessons. They are claims about who belongs at the center of the story. When a city raises Columbus in bronze, it is often celebrating courage, exploration, immigrant pride, or national origins. When a city removes Columbus, it is often acknowledging pain, correcting exclusion, or rejecting an old justification for conquest. Each action manufactures reputation in real time. But let's slow down and look at the machinery that builds these reputations, because once you see it everywhere. First, there is the scarcity and mediation of sources. Columbus did keep logs and write letters, but many documents survive through copies, translations, and editorial hands. Later, compilers shaped the record, sometimes emphasizing piety, sometimes emphasizing discovery, sometimes muting cruelty, sometimes exaggerating it. Even the language. Indians, savages, subjects, slaves, carries ideological weight that modern readers must parse. Second, there is political incentive. In Columbus's own life, he wrote for patrons, framing his journey as a success regardless of reality. After his death, Spain managed his image to protect imperial legitimacy. Rival European powers weaponized Spanish cruelty narratives for propaganda. America adopted Columbus as a unifying founder. Immigrant communities embraced him for belonging. Activists and scholars later foregrounded indigenous perspectives to challenge triumphalist history. Each stage did not simply discover the truth about Columbus. It selected and amplified the parts of the story that served its needs. Third, there is the emotional economy of symbols. Columbus is easy to visualize. A man at a prow, a flag on a shore, so he becomes a canvas for hope or outrage. People who have never read his writings feel they know him because the myth is vivid. Fourth, there is education. What children learn becomes what adults defend. A generation raised on noble paintings will feel attacked when the story changes. A generation raised hearing about catastrophe will feel betrayed by celebrations. This is not only about facts, it is about identity, and identity fights harder than evidence. So, what then is Columbus? Explorer, villain, or myth? He was an explorer in the plain sense. He navigated unknown routes to Europeans, crossed the Atlantic under dangerous conditions, and initiated sustained contact between hemispheres that had been largely separated for millennia. That is real. He was also a colonizer and governor, whose actions and policies contributed to enslavement, violence, and suffering in the Caribbean. He participated in and rationalized exploitation. He pursued wealth and status with a zeal that made other people's lives negotiable. That is also real, and he is a myth, an invented figure larger than life, simplified, polished, weaponized, because no human being can carry the symbolic weight that has been stacked onto his name. The Columbus who proved the earth was round is myth. Educated, Europeans already knew the earth was spherical, and the debate in 1492 was about distances, not shape. The Columbus who discovered America is myth, because the Americas were already inhabited by millions of people with complex societies, and because Norse voyages to North America centuries earlier complicate the idea of first. The Columbus, who alone caused genocide, is also myth in the sense of oversimplification. The catastrophe involved multiple expeditions, policies, diseases, and structures of empire beyond one man's personal hand. Yet myth does not mean harmless. Myths authorize actions. The heroic Columbus myth authorized the idea that conquest was destiny, and that indigenous peoples were background characters. The villain Columbus myth can authorize the idea that history is simply a morality play of monsters and innocents, relieving societies of the harder work of understanding systems and complicity. The truth sits in a more unsettling place. Columbus is a hinge of history, and hinges creak because they bear weight. Imagine him again on that first island, sunlight on water, men kneeling with banners, Taino watching from the tree line. Imagine two futures branching from that moment, one told in celebratory parades, another whispered in mourning, and understand that both futures are real because they were lived. The manufacturing of Columbus's reputation is, in the end, the manufacturing of a continent's story about itself. Whether the Atlantic crossing is framed as a dawn or a disaster, whether modernity is framed as progress or plunder, whether national identity can absorb uncomfortable truths without shattering. Every era chooses its Columbus. The court of Ferdinand and Isabella chose a Columbus that justified investment and empire. Rival European empires chose a Columbus that could smear Spain while emulating its gains. The early United States chose a Columbus that offered a heroic origin untainted by British rule. 19th century America chose a Columbus that fit industrial spectacle and expansionist confidence. Italian-American communities chose a Columbus that offered dignity in the face of discrimination. Indigenous activists and modern scholars chose a Columbus that exposed the violence hidden beneath celebration. And now, in the 21st century, we choose again, in real time, on social media and city council agendas, in classrooms and museums, in the shadow of toppled statues and renamed holidays. If you listen closely, you can hear the same sound that kept Columbus awake on the Atlantic. Wood straining, water pushing, the hull of a story under pressure. because the past is not just what happened, it is what we decide it meant. Columbus wanted to be remembered as a chosen man sailing under God's favor, and he was remembered that way for centuries by those who benefited from the world his voyage helped create. Others remember him as the first wave of a storm that took their world apart. Both are pieces of the same truth, and neither can be erased without distorting reality. The man is dead, but the name is alive because it is useful. Useful for pride, useful for protest, useful for belonging, useful for reckoning. And that is the final, uneasy revelation. When we argue about Columbus, we are rarely arguing about a navigator from Genoa alone. We are arguing about ourselves, about what kind of story we want to live inside, and what we are willing to admit happened on the shore when the sails appeared.